This is it's 10:02 on August 30th.
Recording in progress.
Okay, I'll say that again. It's August 30th, 2023. We're in Oreille County in Newport at the PV with a hearing with, let me just hang on here. Responsible growth, Northeast Washington and Spokane River Keepers versus Oreille County. This is case number 23-1-0005. My name is Bill Hinkle. I'm the presiding officer. To my left is Jim. He's Western Region member of the board. There's only 3 of us right now. Our third member has a conflict, so there'll just be 2 of us on this case. Hearing and coming up.
I'm sorry, can't hear you.
Yeah, we've lost audio.
Hear me at all now?
Yes.
You can hear me, so I have to speak louder?
I think it just cut out for a second.
Okay. So we have Zachary Griffin for the petitioner, Nathan Smith for the county. By way of just, I guess the building, you probably all here, the public's all familiar with where the restrooms are over yonder. We'll try to take a break at some point, maybe around after the board questions, after the respondents' response. We'll probably have a break if we need one. Okay, and so I ask either party, either the attorneys for either party, on my call in, feel free. Okay, if we need a break. Let's see. I want to be real clear. If we have any comments from the gallery, I'll ask you to leave. Okay, this is not a political rally. This is a hearing, the Growth Management Hearings Board. So no signs, no comments. If that starts to happen, I'll clear the room and we'll just have the parties here. Is that clear with everybody? Okay, good. I didn't think I'd have a problem, but I thought maybe I should mention it. With that, we'll have the petitioner's opening argument, then we'll have board questions, and by the way, we will pepper you probably. I don't know how you are, but we like to ask questions in the middle of your testimony, but we'll make sure you have time. If we take away from your time, testimony time, you'll have a half hour for the petitioner's opening arguments, then you'll have board questions, we'll have the respondent's response, you'll have 40 minutes, and then we'll have 10-minute petitioner's reply with questions throughout that, and then we'll adjourn. So any questions from either party at this point? Yeah, no, Mr. Chair. Thank you. All right. With that, I'm going to open it up to Zachary Griffin for the petitioners. You have 30 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the record, I'm Zach Griffin with Bricklin and Newman. I represent the appellants RG New, Responsible Growth Northeast Washington, and Spokane Riverkeeper. Board members of RG New are behind me, and Jerry White, the Spokane Riverkeeper, is in the room as well. I'd like to make a brief appreciation for the rain that I drove through yesterday and walked through today. May have put out any smoldering fires. Amen. Oreille County approved sweeping amendments to its comprehensive plan, its future land use map, and its development regulations, including its sensitive areas code. It did not analyze any alternatives to its proposed action or prepare an EIS. Residential development would be allowed as a primary use in areas where it was prohibited before. Oreille County's action does away with the old public lands designation where single-family residential and accessory uses to single-family residential were prohibited, and has moved those public lands into land use designations where single-family residential is a permitted primary use. Some of this residential development is likely to occur in forested areas that are prone to wildfire. While I was finalizing our reply brief 2 weekends ago, some of RG News members and their family members had evacuated from wildfires in residential areas and forested lands. Others were either packed and ready to go or ready to pack at a moment's notice. But the county did not analyze the impacts of allowing new single-family residential development along single ingress and egress roads in forested lands within the wildland-urban interface. The wildland-urban interface is sometimes called the WUI. It's the area where a built environment intersects with or meets with a natural environment. Human settlements in the WUI are at greater risk of catastrophic wildfire. The county did not even map the wildland-urban interface, let alone consider it in this action.
Okay, I have a question for you. Is that required by GMA?
The GMA requires, the SEPA requires that the county analyze the probable significant adverse impact. So it was required under SEPA.
But mapping is not required in the law, correct?
Under the GMA, there's no specific requirement that I am aware of to map the wildland to urban interface.
That's all I need, thank you.
The county's action would allow planned unit developments, PUDs, for the first time, and newly created industrial and commercial land use designations are part of this action and were mapped in the future land use map. But these new designations were never implemented in the development regs, either the existing development regs or the development regs that were part of the resolution that was approved by the Board of County Commissioners. The minimum required buffers for streams and wetlands within the county are drastically reduced by the resolution. Uses that were once existing uses that were once existing non-conforming uses within the county, or existing or planned uses that would have been only allowed as conditional uses and subject to conditional use protections, would now be permitted uses after the resolution. That results in a loss of county authority to regulate them, because permitted uses have variances available to them and reasonable use exemptions available to them, even exemptions from the sensitive areas code, whereas an existing non-conforming use would not. The county describes all these sweeping changes as, and I'm quoting from their response brief, quote, the mere changing of a few land use designations and providing for a few additional uses, end quote. That's their response brief at 2. And I'll quote something else from the response brief that I think is appropriate to that, and I love this quote. The county said, quote, the reality could not be farther from the truth. That's from the county's brief at the bottom of page 3, and I just love that phrase, even though it doesn't actually make sense. It's like a Yogi Berra saying, the reality could not be farther from the truth. Resolution R2308 would substantially interfere with the fulfillment of the goals of the Growth Management Act. The county says you should defer to it, that this board should defer to the county, but the courts have spoken to that. Under the Cooper Point Association v. Thurston County case, quote, notwithstanding the deference language of RCW 3670A 3201, the board acts properly when it forgoes deference to a county's plan that is not consistent with the requirements and goals of the GMA, end quote. No deference to the county is warranted here. The board should issue a determination of invalidity for the resolution. Under SEPA, despite the probable significant adverse environmental impacts of the county's landscape scale amendments, the county failed to analyze any impacts under SEPA. The board should vacate the county's SEPA determination of non-significance and order the county to prepare an EIS.
Mr. Griffin, on the SEPA issue, the county says, per Office of Financial Management, population growth through 2039 is likely to be, I think they said, 45 persons per year. Is that in dispute?
That is not in dispute.
So that's, I would say, most people would see that as a pretty slow rate of growth, pretty minimal growth, 45 persons per year. Is that is that sprawl? Is that, unplanned growth, or is that just a very, to my impression, it'd be a very slow rate of growth So is that significant impact of that, allowing that level of growth to continue?
That may be a significant impact because it's not only the growth in population that's at issue, but the allowance of new, never before permitted uses in areas where they were never permitted before.
Residential uses is largely what you're objecting to, right?
Also industrial and commercial uses,
Okay.
which were not land use designations before this resolution, and now they are.
But the residential uses appear to be minimal.
It depends on where they are in large part. So for instance, existing residential uses must comply with wetland and riparian habitat area buffers. The county is slashing those buffers significantly so that even if there were no population growth within the county, the existing residents of the county would be allowed to encroach much more closely to critical areas than was the case before the resolution. They will also be allowed to build in areas where single-family residential development was not allowed before the resolution.
But that in itself is not a violation of GMA. So you said this a number of times about industrial growth, industrial uses, residential. So how does that violate the growth management? Just a change in use is not in itself a violation.
They violate the growth management, and I'll get to these in a moment. I was giving an overview at the beginning, but they violate the Growth Management Act by having an internally inconsistent plan and by failing to adequately protect rural character, which they don't define, and by failing to protect natural areas and critical areas. And I'll get to those in a moment. Under SEPA, the board should vacate the determination of non-significance and order the county to prepare an EIS. And I'll address the GMA issues first and SEPA afterwards. The county failed to protect rural character. This is our issues 1 through 4, 10 through 16, and 19. For a start, the county nowhere defines rural character in the resolutions. Or in the resolution in the comp plan or in the development regs. In response to our argument on this point, the county lists a number of public hearings and land use policies, but lists of land use policies and public hearings do not show that the county defined rural character. County's response brief does not point to anywhere where the resolution defines rural character, because that definition is not found in the resolution or the comp plan.
Does the GMA require a definition of rural character or require that the county establish patterns of rural development?
The GMA requires a written record that shows how when the county considers local circumstances, it must prepare a written record that shows how the provisions that it's considering harmonize with the goals of the GMA and the rest of the plan. And this plan states as a goal, I don't have the direct quote in front of me, but protect and preserve rural character.
Right, not define it. I mean, you're harping on the fact that they failed to define it.
Yes, I am harping on the fact that they failed to define it because you can't establish harmony with something or protect something unless you have defined that thing first.
Okay.
The rural character might be protected through a table of permitted uses that sets out what uses are allowed within rural residential areas or rural zones or natural resources zones, what kind of setbacks are required there, screening buffers and things like that. But no revised table of permitted uses was ever created by the county, as the county now admits. Nor was ever a revised table of permitted uses adopted by the county, because how could they adopt something they never created? The county in its brief inexplicably argues that it did adopt an amended table of permitted uses. But the draft 2020 TOPU, Table of Permitted Uses, which is the most recent draft there is, allows commercial and light industrial uses in rural and rural residential areas as conditional uses without assuring conditions that will be imposed to protect rural character as required by the statute 3670A079.
I think that's a stretch. I don't, so the essence of the conditional use process is to protect rural character or to protect the foundation of the existing land that's designated. Just to write and make a conditional use. So explain to me how that does that. Just saying it doesn't mean it's so. I know you make to quote him, you make a lot of declaratory statements without citations. So I'd like to actually see what you're talking about because that doesn't make sense to me.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Okay, I'm just telling you.
Thank you.
Okay.
So specifically on this record, at record index number 69, that's the comment and response matrix that was prepared by the county. At base number POC 001402, this is the comment response to comment number 69. The county said in response to a question about the TOPU, quote, Table of Permitted Uses was updated to reflect that no industrial uses are allowed in the rural residential zones. Light industrial is conditional in rural, natural resource, and commercial, and footnote 9 was added stating that they must be resource dependent in the rural and natural resources zones, end quote. But that was never done. Neither copy of the TOPU that is in the record, the one at record index number 120 or the record index number 173, shows those updates. Light industrial is still shown as conditional in the rural residential zone, and there is no footnote attached to it stating that it must be resource dependent in the rural and natural resource zones. The county has now admitted that there was no revised table of permitted uses generated. That's at the county's brief at 25 note 4. Moving on from the TOPU, the newly adopted rural land use policy number 10 violates RCW 3670A 110 sub 1 by requiring the adoption of zoning classifications, quote, to direct commercial uses to more populated areas of the county, end quote, without ever specifying that those more populated areas should be urban growth areas, and without precluding urban type commercial uses outside of urban growth areas.
Just as an aside, how many and which UGAs exist in the county?
I'm not sure of the answer to that. I think there's 2. But I'm not sure that's correct. I would be happy to supply that information after the hearing when I can look it up.
I don't know if that's necessary, but I'm just curious as getting perspective. All right, thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Thank you. Regarding planned unit developments or PUDs, as we stated in our brief, and I won't read my briefs here, but I'm just giving an overview of them. The new PUD regulations fail to assure visual compatibility with surrounding rural areas. This more dense type of rural development can be visually incompatible with surrounding rural areas.
And let me ask about that point. And sorry if I keep interrupting, but I'm sure Mr. Hinkle
I would welcome it.
Give you additional time rather than waiting till half an hour from now.
Yes, sir.
Is petitioner's challenge to PUDs in the rural areas per se, because GMBH sort of anticipates allowing that, or is it to how the county addresses it in terms of not having sufficient development regulations to, regulate the PUDs?
More the latter. We're not saying that every PUD that would be authorized or could be authorized by this resolution is necessarily visually incompatible with surrounding rural areas.
Right.
We're saying that the resolution adopted by the county does not contain assurances that they will be visually compatible with adjoining or adjacent rural uses, rural areas, excuse me. So the GMA should put side roads on the newly authorized PUDs that are enforceable and that assure visual compatibility. So, for instance, if it says should provide 50% opacity, a vegetative buffer should provide 50% opacity, that does not assure visual compatibility with surrounding rural areas. And I think that we can anticipate that even if the overall density of the PUD is the same as individual single-family homes scattered over a number of parcels, if that density is concentrated next to a road, say, or near the beginning of an access road off a bigger road, the visual impact of that will be great because the public will see, and existing residents will see the PUD and not the acres of land set aside behind the PUD further away from thoroughfares.
So I understand that. That in itself, how is that a real violation? Well, this is kind of, the supposition is that we're making the GMA assumes that regulations are legal and the standard until we have this hearing, and then the burden is on you to show why. And so far, what I hear is you don't like seeing greater density by a road, but maybe they want to see the people that actually buy the lots want to see the land also, and not, I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why you would do that. That in itself, what you just said, is I don't see it as a violation. I mean, this is really a matter of opinion, visual compatibility. So what you're saying is we should never do in rural areas, never have any 1 acre lots or small acre lots along the road.
No, sir, that's not what I'm saying.
That's what it comes across as. I'm just telling you, it doesn't make sense to me.
Okay.
So let's clear that up.
Mr. Chair, what we're saying is that PUDs were not allowed before. The PUDs are new in this resolution.
PUDs are an innovative planning technique used in a lot of rural counties.
Yes, sir.
And in itself, it preserves a lot of acreage throughout the state. It's been very successful. So tell me why it's not going to be successful here. Because of visual compatibility, that's a hard one to prove. And, again, what's your standard? What's the standard here? Do you remember?
It's the county's action is presumed correct and
clearly erroneous.
You must have a firm and definite conviction that the mistake has been made.
Okay, so help me. I'm not trying to pick on you, but really, I'm not. But I really have to understand this because I didn't see it in the brief. So I really want to understand.
Our argument is that we agree that innovative land use development techniques are not only allowed, but can be good. Yeah. PUDs can be good. They do set aside land and preserve land and have a lot of benefits. But when the county created PUDs, it should have put railings or sideboards in the comprehensive plan and in its development regulations that assured that it would continue to protect rural character. And it just didn't do that. It will leave that all for site-by-site, case-specific analysis down the road. And in this GMA action, the county should have, at the outset, assured that when people are proposing PUDs later, they will be visually compatible with the existing rural character.
Okay, you should probably keep going. I've given you an extra 5 minutes.
I just want to follow up.
Okay.
Well, back to what you're saying, you gave the example of, the impact of, distributed housing is not as disruptive of rural character as when they are, congregated in a single area. With another name, that's clustering, which the GMA says clustering is fine. I mean, isn't that what the county is proposing? I mean, in short, well, clustering is what you were telling us is, well, that's gonna have a terrible impact on visual character in the rural area. Clustering is spelled out in the GMA as appropriate.
We're not saying that clustering or PUDs are necessarily going to have a terrible impact.
Right.
At all. We're saying that the county should have taken steps now to assure that they don't. And they could have. They could have put language in the new PUD provisions that are authorized by this action to assure that they will be visually compatible and meet the other requirements of the GMA. And they just didn't. And our argument is you should have included language that assures that when you authorized PUDs.
Just based upon your familiarity maybe with other jurisdictions, what sort of assurances do jurisdictions commonly use that meet GMA, scrutiny?
I would have to get back to you on that. I haven't had a PUD.
Yeah, and I don't mean to put you on the spot on that, but you're saying the county didn't do anything to assure, rural protection of rural character. And so I'm thinking, what are you suggesting that they should have done? And again, we can't dictate what they do, and you can't dictate what they do, but I'm just wondering, it's like, sort of as a per example, here's they're allowing PUDs, but they fail to do X, Y, and Z. Not that you could mandate it, not that we could mandate it, but it would certainly help flesh out any potential claim of error, right? They could have done X, Y, and Z just like, Lewis County did, but they didn't. And that's why I'm trying to get my hands around.
The example we use in our brief is the 50% opacity vegetative buffer standard.
Okay.
So they could have, 50% opacity is not very opaque. They could have, and we think they should have, increased that required opacity, year-round opacity, so that this more dense residential development likely near a road is less visible from the road. The county failed to conserve natural resources lands. This is our issue 21. As we explained in our brief, there's a proposed land swap, a large land swap, 30,000 acres of federal land that are to be privatized in the Stimson U.S. Forest Service land swap. The great majority of that Forest Service land that will be conveyed to Stimson is in Oreille County, not in a neighboring county. That's clear from record index number 261 that shows the swap lands and shows the county line. That's at POC 006038. These are lands where residential development was prohibited, but now will be allowed outright on these lands as a permitted primary use. The county said in response to our argument that we ignore the plain, I'm quoting, ignores the plain text of the GMA, which explicitly permits accessory uses in natural resource lands. But single family residential would be, after this resolution, a primary permitted use, not an accessory use. Single family residential development brings a host of impacts, including fire hazards, the impacts of permit exempt water wells, and the impacts of domestic cats and dogs, which harass and kill wildlife, as was testified to by Woody Myers and Ed Siskel. The county created an internally inconsistent comp plan. Even though the comp plan states an intent to maintain the rural character of Oreille County, it fails to protect that rural character for the reasons I discussed, and that is not consistent. The resolution is not consistent with the protection of natural surface water flows and groundwater and surface water recharge and discharge areas. This relates to the permit exempt domestic wells. The Spokane River Keeper, Jerry White, with us today, offered testimony to the county on this issue that's found at record index number 291. Surface water flows in the county and in the Little Spokane River and in other tributaries to it are fed by groundwater, especially during the summer months. That means, as the Spokane River Keeper testified, that many of the sources, and these aquifers are separate from the Spokane Valley Rafton Prairie aquifer. These are smaller often perched aquifers that feed the surface waters. And this means that many of the sources are small, discrete pockets of groundwater that at once maintain the surface water of the watershed and are vulnerable to human pumping. Because when you dig a well, you dig down until you hit one of these aquifers and then you stop. If that aquifer is giving groundwater to the river, that's a problem.
Okay, so what's the system they have here that is in this county for permitting exempt wells? Because there's a statewide requirement that counties can no longer just check a box and say an exempt well meets the need.
Well, in this county, the county cited to their environmental sensitive areas policy number 5, which calls for developers to document water availability. But that the development regulations do not require that documentation for permit exempt domestic wells. Similarly, in the development regs in this county, XX.52.030 binding site plans states as an approval criteria of sub E2, the applicant shall demonstrate that adequate water rights exist to serve the binding site plan, quote, except when water withdrawal is exempt from obtaining a water right permit under RCW 9044.050. And that statute says that after that, no withdrawal of public groundwaters of the state shall be begun, nor shall any well or works for such withdrawal be constructed unless an application to appropriate such waters, blah, blah, blah.
Listen, I'm from Petitious County. You don't have to explain groundwater to me.
Okay, so, yes, sir. So you're familiar with the exemption for wells and industrial uses under 5,000.
What system do you have here that's not going to work? That's not going to protect groundwater? Because you make a statement that there could be ground surface water connection, and yet does that mean there's no way that would be caught? There's no way that is evaluated in the permitting process here in the county?
I don't see where that is evaluated in the permitting process for permit exempt domestic wells. I don't see where that is evaluated in the county for industrial uses under 5,000 gallons, 5,000 gallons a day. And
where's the Department of Ecology with that issue? Did they make any comments on this issue at all?
I'm unaware of that.
I'm not aware of they did either. And I can promise you, if there's a problem, they would comment when it comes to groundwater. That they do to every county I've seen. So the lack of their testimony on groundwater concern is remarkable to me. So we'll address this later with the county and try to dig into it more. Maybe in your reply you'll have something too. So let's continue. I've kind of taken about 10 minutes away from your.
Well, I appreciate your questions, and I'm happy to respond to them, and appreciate the extra time. I would also like an opportunity to check the record to see if DOE did comment on groundwater in the county. I'm unaware of it, but it may be in there somewhere.
You have about 10 more minutes.
Okay. I will try to move quickly. Okay. On the earlier issue of the wildland urban interface, I'll just refer you to that permit, the comment and response document, record index number 6D9069 at 1385, where the public asked, have you mapped the wildland urban interface? And the county responded, quote, wildland urban interface was not mapped. The county failed to adopt regulations implementing its new industrial and commercial land use designations that are shown on the future land use map. There was a statement by the county, again, in that record index number 69. It says comment 15 in that document. There was a question about how these would be implemented, and the county said, quote, there are new development regulations that will also need to be written and go through the same public process, which will set regulations necessary for any new zoning designation. But this was never done. The development regulations simply name the new zones and provide a one-sentence description of the industrial and commercial zones at XX.26.030. that's hardly implementing these new industrial and commercial designations.
So let's be clear, a new designation of property versus a new zone, a new complete zone that isn't currently in the code.
These are both. These are industrial and commercial land use designations and zones, or the table of permitted uses says use/zone.
Maybe I'm not being clear. So currently there are zones. There are no new zones created. In other words, new zoning codes. There was new designations. Lands were rezoned. There were land use designation changes, but were there actual new zones created?
Yes.
Okay. What are those? Which ones are those? Did they not create regulations for? I'd like to be specific.
The industrial, and I'm quoting from or looking at the development regulations at XX.26.030. It's titled Establishment of Zoning Districts. And it says the following zoning districts are established in accordance with the provisions of the Pend Oreille County Comprehensive Plan. And sub G is industrial lands and sub I is commercial. But there's no implementation of them. There's no description of the uses that are allowed in those zones, no lot size, no covered specifications, no setbacks, no buffers that apply in these new industrial and commercial zoning districts.
Can you give me the number again real quick?
Yes.
XX 26.030.
Sorry, let me get back there. 26.030. And that's the establishment of zoning districts.
Okay.
And then there's lettered zoning districts under it, and G and I are industrial and commercial respectively.
I got those, thank you.
The pre-existing, there was a case discussed in the briefs where the pre-existing regulations before the county's action, or city's action in that case, possibly, effectively implemented what the county was proposing. But here, by contrast, the existing regulations don't implement industrial commercial zones, and neither do the new regulations. I think that the issue of lack of notice and opportunity to comment, or issue number 26, was adequately addressed in the brief. I'm happy to answer questions about it if you like.
I did have a question on that. So you noted in your brief that you were saying ladies policy number 2 was significantly changed. The comment period closed. I don't know if you specified what actually the change was.
I think we do in the original brief,
Okay,
and just touch on it in the reply brief.
Okay. So what was the change?
It was rewritten substantially and moved to a new number, and then there was a new number 2. So number 2 was changed and moved, and then a different.
Yeah, and I saw that in the brief, the renumbering. But I guess maybe I failed to understand my misreading. What was the change?
I can tell you in a moment if you like.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I remember reading that section of the brief a couple of times, scratching my head, trying to figure out.
So in our initial opening brief,
Yeah, I'm looking at page 10 of your brief.
page 10,
Right,
yeah,
it says after the comment period closed, the county significantly changed the language of rural land use policy number 2. But what did it? And it inserted a wholly new land use policy too. So what was the difference, and how did it change, and why is that change important to it?
I don't have the red line in front of me. I can respond in 10 minutes.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
Let me just make a quick note. Rural. I think that the Pend Oreille, our issues about former Ponderay Newsprint Company and the lack of granular analysis of how that should be protected is likely adequately briefed, but I would like to direct the board to the audio of the May 11th, 2021 Planning Commission meeting. This is record index number 160.
Excuse me, have you transcribed the audio? Because we're not going to listen to audio. We never do.
Yeah.
Unless it's transcribed,
Right.
we don't look at it.
I apologize for not making that clear in the pre-hearing meeting that we had conference room. We don't, you have to have that.
I mean, 'cause as a practical matter, it could be a 3-hour hearing and we can't listen to 3 hours of testimony trying to figure out where that is.
I have a specific timestamp and it's 3 minutes. It's the statement of Mike Lithgow, who's part of the Kalispell tribe and was speaking for them in that.
Unless it's been transcribed, I mean, that's a pretty much solid policy that the board has. We're not going to, I don't think it's up to Bill whether.
No, I think it's even in our, it's in the WAC, isn't it? That we don't.
Yeah.
It may be that I think Mike Lithgow was reading from a prepared statement to the Planning Commission.
Maybe that's the
And
index.
I would like to look for that, and I beg the board to allow me to submit that record index number. If he submitted that statement in writing, I'd like to put it before you because he says it as well as or better than I can.
Any objection?
No objection.
Okay, if you can find it in writing, then we'll accept it.
Thank you. I think best available science, I'm cutting things short. I think best available science regarding wetland and riparian area buffers was adequately addressed in the briefs.
Well, that's a question I just had as well. Sounds like I'm getting all my questions now before the question period, but why not? You brought it up, and maybe there's a more efficient way of getting in. Look at page 15 of your brief. County reduced the widths of riparian habitat areas by over 50, 85 feet. Reduction not only ignored the best available science, et cetera, et cetera. What was the best available science? I didn't see that in the brief.
The best available science was what FutureWise told the county.
Right, and I see that
FutureWise was basing that on riparian.
But what is, and I didn't see the citation, unless it's buried in one of these citations on page 15. What was the best available science on buffer widths?
The document prepared by the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife titled Riparian Ecosystems, Volume 1, Science Synthesis and Management Implications 2020.
And I'll admit, I haven't followed up on the citations you had on page 15. Is that, and is that at odds with 50 to 85 feet?
Yes.
They reduced it by 50 to 85 feet, but the adopted widths are at odds with the cited best available science.
Yes.
Okay, that wasn't clear to me. I mean, I saw the FutureWise quote, FutureWise's comment, but I didn't see, the air widths are this, best available science from Fish and Wildlife is X, right? Okay.
Yes.
So I would find that falling down on the sites on page 15.
I believe so. That's what FutureWise was citing as the best available science, and the buffer widths protect functions and values of these critical areas. And their critical areas are critical for a reason. It's important to protect them and all of their functions and values. And we have the science from Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife saying, here's how you do that. But the county did not change its inadequate buffer widths in response, and instead it relied on a study from a different county and padded the record with an undated, unsigned memorandum that's attached to the end of the comment response matrix, record index number 69. Counties can, in some instances, deviate from best available science. You don't have to use best available science, but
Hold on. No, you have to consider it.
you have to consider
You can't ignore it. And also, I might add that best available science is not defined just as what the departments say it is, correct?
Yes,
Okay, so let's be clear on the record on that, because
thank you.
yeah, I'm kidding.
I'm not meaning to give anything away. I'm acknowledging that a county has to thoroughly consider, it has to be aware of the best available science, it has to consider it. If it deviates from the best available science, it must show its work. It must explain why. And the county didn't do that here. It says, and I'm quoting from the RIN record index number 69, at 1412, the county says it determined from a policy perspective that not following the BAS was acceptable, but it failed to disclose those policies. It just failed to disclose how it was seeking to further those policies, and it failed to disclose the extent of harm that would result in not following the BAS. I'm going to skip over the table of permitted uses section. I think we've addressed that and certainly addressed in our brief, and conclude with SEPA. The county didn't analyze any alternatives to its proposed action. It did not prepare an EIS. Instead, the planning director, Greg Snow, wearing his applicant hat, answered the questions in the SEPA checklist and then put on his responsible official hat, reviewed his answers, determined they showed there would be no significant adverse impacts, and issued a DNS. SEPA requires a searching review for threshold determinations. The threshold determination is most likely the most important step of the SEPA process. That's the Norway Hills case. And when a jurisdiction amends its comprehensive plan or changes zoning, quote, a detailed and comprehensive SEPA environmental review is required. That's a Western Washington Growth Management Hearings Board case, associations, citizens concerned about Chambers-led basin. Pend Oreille County here did both. They amended their comprehensive plan and they changed zoning, but the county did not do a detailed and comprehensive SEPA environmental review. County failed to base its DNS on adequate information regarding a number of things, including the impacts of turning prohibited uses into permitted uses, the impacts to critical areas and wildlife habitat, the impacts of sprawl in rural areas and the attendant increased fire danger, and how climate change would exacerbate these impacts. The county in response says, I don't know, and you base the checklist on your own knowledge. So saying I don't know or not applicable or does not apply are perfectly acceptable answers. But that's true as far as it goes, but that assumes somebody else is going to review those answers and determine whether you've created a gap in necessary information. And here, Greg Snow was both answering, was the applicant, and the responsible official, and was checking his own work. He answered not applicable, non-project action 49 times in the SEPA checklist.
But that in itself is not a violation of SEPA. So what I'd like to know from you is what specific environmental impacts in the record are pointed to that were not addressed. And I mean specific impacts, okay, not suppositions, and not concerns about a certain issue, but what specific impacts?
The wholesale change from conditional uses to permitted uses across the entire county may have a probable significant adverse impact.
What impacts? See, that's the point. You can say it may have an impact, but what impacts are they overlooking?
They are overlooking the impact to critical areas, because a conditional use or an existing non-conforming use has to comply with what the county has now reduced in terms of buffers. You can't get a reasonable use exemption for an existing non-conforming use, or I believe a conditional use. But once your use is permitted, you have a reasonable expectation to use your property as other people in your zone use their properties. And if there's a critical area on it, like a wetland, you can seek an exemption from the Sensitive Areas Code to allow you to use your property for this now permitted use. That wasn't available before in large areas of the county and will be available now. So losing the protections of the critical use review process, I can come up with some other examples.
So exemptions to critical areas, again, is not an unheard of thing. In every county they're allowed. And simply saying that you're harming the environment because you have a system that allows exemptions, the criteria for exemption is very strict. And it's also another place where they can be sued, the county can be sued. So I'm curious, are you familiar with the standards in order to grant a critical areas exemption? Have you looked at that?
I have looked at
In what
that.
way are those exemptions putting the environment at risk?
I've looked at that, but not in this county and not recently. But I had a case recently near the city of Medical Lake.
I don't want to hear that.
Okay.
But this is the point here is that simply saying there are exemptions in the critical areas ordinance for new designations in itself is not a SEPA issue unless you can point to a specific environmental impact that will not be covered in the code. And I'd want to know what that is. I mean, it's good to be concerned. This is why we have critical areas. It's also why we have a very strong process, I think, in every county in the state on exemptions. They're not allowed willy-nilly.
I have an example.
Yeah.
Let's say there's a lot, and the entirety or almost the entirety of the lot is covered by either a wetland or the wetlands buffer, making it impossible to site a single-family residential dwelling on that lot.
Mm-hmm.
Further assume that before this resolution passed, single-family residential was prohibited on that lot. No problem. You cannot go build your prohibited home on this lot and go into the buffers. But once you make it a permitted primary use on the lot, then the owner of that lot can say, this is a permitted use here, and I am prevented from making reasonable use of my property because of these wetland buffers. And then I think it's very likely that they would get an exemption to the strict application of the sensitive areas code to allow them to make reasonable residential use. Now that residential use is reasonable.
That's a hypothetical that's a pretty big question. I mean, I'm trying to think of any case that I can remember where they've ignored buffers, established buffers, and critical areas in order to build a house in that situation. I mean, that's a hypothetical I've never heard of before, but maybe they're out there.
We argue a lot of those cases.
Your point is made. Yeah, your point is made, and I'll take it into consideration.
And to be fair, they're all hypotheticals.
Yeah.
This is a non-project action.
I got you, but the thing about the SEPA, about challenging the SEPA checklist is they have to be very specific on what was missed, right?
Well,
that didn't exist before. You know, ideally before they even did the amendments, they had critical areas and they had the same situation could arise. You follow me?
yes.
So, okay.
But the county should have looked at the full build-out. It should have looked at what is authorized by these changes across the entire landscape. This is county-wide non-project action. And the county should have dug in and said, okay, if we do this, they should have looked at hypotheticals. They should have looked at what will happen to lots that are encumbered by critical area buffers.
Okay, let me ask you another question. I hate to harp on this, but this is a really important thing. And we're very strict on SEPA, just for the record. As you probably know, you've probably seen recent decisions from us. So I'm really trying to dig into the examples here. When we talk about specific impacts on the record, I think was my first question. In the record of their decision, in other words, were there any letters of concern from any of the state agencies in regard to this, that they were missing this, or that this had been missed? Was the SEPA challenged initially? Any of those things in the record?
I have something in the record that shows a potential impact. It's from the South Pond Oreille Fire Rescue Organization, not a state agency. But that district, the South Pond Oreille Fire Rescue, said that, quote, as more land areas become available on the real estate market, the district, that is their fire district, is experiencing additional growth in previously undeveloped areas. This creates new challenges with regards to response times, water supply availability, and interface issues. That's the record index number 276.
I read that. That's, I understand that. And, of course, let's move on and let you finish, because we have, like, going to ask you a bunch of questions here. I think let's take 5 more minutes.
Okay, thank you. I may not need it, but as I was pointing out, the county had to look at what will result from this non-project action, and it didn't do that. Agencies must evaluate the environmental impacts of non-project actions up front and not wait until the project level. There's plenty of case law on that, but here, the applicant, Mr. Snow for the county, repeatedly answered checklist questions with impacts of specific projects will be addressed by project level SEPA review, or potential impacts will be addressed by project level review. But of course, lots of the specific projects that would flow from this action are not subject to SEPA review. Single family residential development doesn't generally require SEPA review on a project level basis. And the county did not assess whether the information that was not provided, or they failed to provide in the checklist, was essential to a reasonable choice among alternatives. The county didn't assess cumulative impacts across the landscape of its choices, of its action, and it did not examine the cumulative impacts of changing non-conforming or conditional uses to permitted uses, as I mentioned before. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for questions. I have actually one question right now, and I'll get to that after my colleague.
I just have one remaining question. Back in SEPA, the DNS, I understand that it was appealed to the county's hearing examiner who upheld the DNS. Procedurally, where does that put the DNS and the board in terms of determining the adequacy of the DNS?
You're reviewing the second hearing examiner decision.
Okay, and I didn't see a lot of argument about the substance of the decision.
That's true. We focused on the substance of the SEPA DNS.
Right. So aren't you asking us, though, to review the hearing examiner's decision? I suppose, maybe I'm wrong, and determine where and if the hearing examiner committed error?
Yes.
Okay.
And as I'm sure you're aware, there were 2 hearing examiner decisions.
Right.
We won the first one, at least in part, and our clients were pro se on the second go round, and the hearing examiner upheld the DNS.
Right. Okay. But I didn't see a lot of argument about, so really our focus then is on the second hearing examiner decision.
Yes.
And I didn't see a lot of argument about why we should reverse the hearing examiner.
That's true. There was not a lot of argument about that.
Okay. That doesn't give us much to work with. I mean, isn't your argument is that the hearing examiner erred by upholding the DNS?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
And that the county erred in issuing the DNS.
Right. But I mean, but that decision to issue the DNS was subject to an administrative appeal. So really what's in front of us, the question is, did the hearing examiner err by upholding the DNS?
Agreed. And we asked you to find that the examiner did err.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. No more questions from you?
No, go ahead.
So you alleged internal inconsistencies, and I know I've heard some general comments about that. Do you have specific language in the comp plan where you assert that it's incompatible with otherwise forced implementation of the language in the comprehensive plan?
Yes, the comprehensive plan, and I'm looking for the specific language, but it states a goal to protect rural character. And then the language that I've quoted earlier in my argument and the lack of language in it is inconsistent with that goal, because it allows, it creates new designations, for instance, the industrial and commercial designations that are incompatible with rural character, at least absent the conditions that the county said it was going to provide in footnote 9 to the table of permitted uses, but then didn't include or adopt, which would have assured that industrial uses in rural areas were resource dependent industrial uses. That exists nowhere now. So there's no assurance that rural character will be protected.
Very good. I'm taking something else there. Thank you. Okay, appreciate you were very concise there when we let you talk.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, it's let's see, it's 11:03. I think we can continue.
I was actually just saying, maybe we just take a break
Take a
now
break.
instead of
Okay,
post and then.
happy to do that. Let's take how much we need? 10 minutes?
Sounds about right.
10-minute break. We'll reconvene